She did the math by candlelight, not because she wanted to, because she had to. Evelyn Mercer sat on the floor of a dying cabin with her 6-year-old son pressed against her chest, and she counted the hours the way a condemned woman counts her last breaths. No firewood, no food, temperature dropping. Snow piling against the door like the world itself was trying to bury them alive. She had told no one how bad it had gotten. Pride is a strange thing. It keeps your mouth shut even when silence is killing you. Nobody was coming. She was sure of it. If this story already has its hooks in you, drop the name of your city in the comments and hit that like button. Let's see how far this story travels. Now settle in. This one's going to take a while. The blizzard didn't announce itself. That was the thing about weather out on the frontier. It didn't give warnings the way people expected. There was no gradual darkening of the sky, no polite drop in temperature, no slow accumulation that gave a person time to prepare. One afternoon in late November, the horizon simply went white. A wall of it, moving fast. And by the time most families in Harlan County had their shutters latched and their livestock brought in, the storm was already on top of them. Cole Ashford was stacking split wood on his porch when the first real gust hit. It came from the northwest, sharp as a slap, and sent a loose piece of burlap sailing off the fence post and into the dark. He squinted into it, jaw tight, and watched the sky turn the color of old bone. "Get inside," he said to his hired hand, Marcus, who was crossing the yard with an armful of hay. Marcus didn't argue. He was a practical man, 40 years old and missing 2 fingers from a bad winter 11 years back. He knew what that sky meant. Cole brought in 3 more armloads of wood before the snow started falling sideways. He latched the barn himself, checked the horses twice, and went inside to the sound of his children arguing. His son, 8-year-old Danny, was upset because his sister had knocked over the wooden fort he'd spent 3 days building near the hearth. His daughter, 5-year-old Clara, was crying because Danny had yelled at her. And Marcus, who had made it inside ahead of them both, was sitting at the kitchen table pretending to read a newspaper while the whole thing played out. Cole stood in the doorway, boots still on, and looked at his family. Family. He still used the word. He wasn't sure what else to call it. "Danny," he said. His son looked up, jaw set, already preparing to make his case. "Help your sister build it back." "But she—" "I didn't ask what she did. I told you what to do." Danny's jaw tightened further. He had his mother's eyes, that particular shade of dark brown that looked almost black in low light. And sometimes, when the boy made that expression, Cole had to look away fast. Just for a second. Just long enough to get his breathing right again. "Yes, sir," Danny said finally, and dropped to his knees beside the scattered wooden blocks. Cole took off his boots, put them by the door, hung his coat on the hook and stood there a moment with his hand still on the collar of it, staring at the floor. Outside, the wind found a gap somewhere in the eaves and began to whine through it, a sound like something in pain. Tug. The storm lasted 3 days. By the time it broke on the morning of the 4th day, Harlan County was buried under nearly 4 feet of snow. The world outside looked erased, white in every direction, the tree lines reduced to dark smears on the horizon, the road through town invisible beneath a smooth, unbroken surface that gave no hint that a road had ever been there at all. Cole was up before sunrise. He always was. He dressed in the dark, made coffee over the stove, and stood at the kitchen window while the sky turned from black to gray to the pale, washed-out blue of a winter morning. Steam rose from his mug. He held it with both hands. He wasn't a man who talked much. People in town knew that about him. After his wife Ruth died 18 months ago, he'd gotten even quieter. Not cold. People who said Cole Ashford was cold didn't know the difference between cold and careful. He'd just stopped filling silence with noise the way most people did. He'd learned, somewhere in the last year and a half, that silence was honest, that it didn't pretend. He drank his coffee and watched the day come up over the snow. That was when he noticed it. He wasn't even sure what made him look in that direction, southeast, toward the low line of hills where the less prosperous homesteads sat on smaller parcels of land. Maybe it was habit. He'd gotten used to checking the horizon the way a sailor checks the water, without quite knowing why. But he noticed it. Or rather, he noticed what wasn't there. Every chimney in sight had smoke, his own, thick and gray, curling up from both the house and the separate kitchen stack. The Hargrove place a quarter-mile east. Old Denton's property just visible on the ridge. 3, 4, 5 columns of smoke from different points on the landscape, all of them saying the same thing. Someone's home, someone's warm, someone's alive. The Mercer cabin, sitting in the crease between two hills about 2 miles southeast, he could just barely make out its roofline in the distance, had nothing. No smoke. Cole set his mug down on the windowsill. He stood there and stared at that roofline for a good 30 seconds. Told himself it was nothing. Told himself maybe she'd just gotten a late start on the fire. Told himself it wasn't his business. He went and put his boots back on. Getting there was ugly. The horse, a big gray gelding named Silas, wrong name as it turned out, but that was a different story, was not happy about it. Cole had to work to convince the animal out of the barn and into the snow, and once they were moving, the drifts were deep enough in places that the horse was chest deep and lunging, lurching forward in exhausted bursts while Cole leaned over its neck and kept them both aimed south. It took him 45 minutes to cover 2 miles. He didn't let himself think too hard about what he might find. Thinking too hard about something like that was a luxury. It slowed a person down, and slowing down in chest-deep snow and 20-degree weather was a good way to end up in the same situation as whoever you were going to check on. The cabin came into view around a stand of bare cottonwood trees. It was small, smaller than he'd remembered from the last time he'd seen it, which had been the previous summer, when Evelyn Mercer's husband Thomas was still alive, and the place still had the look of somewhere people were actively trying to hold together. Now it looked like the land was in the early stages of reclaiming it. One corner of the roof had a visible sag. The woodpile beside the south wall, he could see it even from 30 yards out, was down to a few scattered pieces, and there was no smoke. He knocked. No answer. He knocked harder, the sound of his fist against the frozen wood flat and dead in the cold air. "Mrs. Mercer." His voice came out rough, like he hadn't used it enough yet that morning. "Mrs. Mercer, it's Cole Ashford, from the Ashford Ranch 2 miles north." Silence. The wind moved through the cottonwoods behind him. A branch cracked somewhere. He tried the latch. It wasn't locked. Out here, most people didn't bother. The door swung inward and a breath of air came out of the cabin that was barely warmer than the air outside. Cole stepped in. It took his eyes a moment to adjust. The cabin's single window faced north and didn't let in much, and the inside was dim and gray and very still. She was on the floor. That was the first thing he saw. Not on the bed, not in a chair. On the floor, with her back against the wall beneath the window, her arms wrapped around something. Her knees were drawn up. She was wearing a coat over what looked like 2 layers of dresses, and her face, when he got close enough to see it, was the color of old candle wax. The something in her arms was her son. The boy was 6 years old, and right now he looked smaller than that. He was tucked inside his mother's coat with her arms locked around him, his face turned in toward her chest, and he wasn't moving. Cole crossed the room in 4 steps and dropped to one knee. "Mrs. Mercer." Her eyes opened, just barely. The lids were heavy, and her gaze was slow to focus, but it found him eventually, found his face, and some part of her registered that something was happening, that the situation had changed. "Cold," she said. The word came out slurred, stripped of consonants, barely a word at all. "I know." He pressed 2 fingers to the boy's neck, found a pulse. Slow, but there. "How long has the fire been out?" She didn't answer right away. Her eyes drifted. "Mrs. Mercer, Evelyn." He used her first name without thinking. "How long?" "Last night." A pause, long enough that he thought she might lose consciousness entirely. "Ran out. I tried to—" Another pause. "The wood was—" She stopped. Cole looked at the hearth. The grate was cold and black. There was a small pile of ash and 1 piece of partially burned wood that had gone out before it was halfway consumed. He could see now why she'd run out. The woodpile outside was almost gone, and the storm would have made it impossible to get more, even if she'd known where to go. He stood up. "I'm going to pick up your son," he said. "He's going to be all right, but I need you to listen to me. Can you do that?" Her eyes were on him. He took that as a yes. "I'm taking you both to my ranch. It's 2 miles. It's going to be cold, and it's going to be hard, but you're going to hold on, and we're going to get there. You understand?" She didn't say anything. "I need you to say you understand." A long pause. Then, barely, yes. He picked up the boy first. Noah. He'd heard the name somewhere, say, maybe from someone in town. The child was almost weightless in his arms in a way that wasn't reassuring, and when Cole gathered him up, the boy made a small sound but didn't fully wake. Cole wrapped him in the blanket from the bed, the only blanket in the place, he noticed, and turned back to Evelyn. She was trying to stand, doing it wrong, her legs not cooperating, one hand braced against the wall and sliding. "Stay still," he said. "I'll come back for you." I know you think you can. Stay still." He carried Noah out to the horse first and settled him against the animal's neck, holding him with one arm. Then he went back inside. Getting Evelyn out was harder. She was more conscious than the boy, but less cooperative, in the way of someone who's cold enough that their body has stopped taking directions from their brain. He got her arm over his shoulder, got her upright, and walked her out into the white. She flinched at the brightness of it, made a sound. "Keep moving," he said. "I'm moving." "I know, keep doing it." He got her up onto the horse behind the boy, and then swung up himself and turned the gelding north toward home. Chapter 2. A roof that wasn't hers, she came back to herself slowly, the way a person emerges from deep water, a little at a time, with resistance. Warmth first. That was the thing that woke her, or the awareness of it. Warmth that she hadn't felt in so long that her body didn't quite know what to do with it. It was almost painful at first, the return of feeling to her fingers and the tip of her nose and the soles of her feet. She was aware dimly of a fire, of weight, blankets, several of them, of voices somewhere close by. One of them was Noah's. She opened her eyes. The ceiling above her was low-beamed and smoke-darkened and unfamiliar. She was lying on a bed, a real bed, with a mattress and a headboard, in a room she didn't recognize. Gray afternoon light came through a window to her left. There were sounds from somewhere deeper in the house. A child's voice, higher and younger than Noah's, and then Noah's voice answering it, and then the sound of something being dragged across a wooden floor. She sat up, too fast. The room tilted, and she put a hand on the edge of the mattress and waited. Easy. She looked up. A woman was standing in the doorway, a stout, gray-haired woman in a canvas apron, holding a cup of something that steamed. "You moved fast for someone who was halfway dead 3 hours ago," the woman said. She wasn't unkind about it, just matter of fact. She crossed the room and held out the cup. "Drink that." Evelyn took it, broth of some kind, thick and slightly salty. She drank it without thinking about it. "Where's my son?" she said. "In the kitchen, driving my children half crazy with questions about horses." This was a different voice, lower, from the doorway. Cole Ashford was standing there now, one shoulder against the frame, arms crossed. He looked, in the warmth and light of his own house, larger than she remembered from the rare occasion she'd seen him in town. He was wearing a work shirt with the sleeves rolled to the elbow, and his hair was damp from where the snow had melted out of it. He didn't smile exactly, but there was something in his face that wasn't quite as closed as she'd expected. "He's been awake for an hour. Ate half a pan of cornbread and asked me 7 questions about the horse." Evelyn exhaled. Something tight in her chest released. "The woman is Hannah," Cole said. "She works for me. Comes in 3 days a week. She's going to make sure you're all right." "I'm all right," Evelyn said. Hannah made a sound that wasn't quite a laugh. "You're alive," she said. "Those are different things, honey." She tried to leave the next morning. It was a predictable thing for her to do, and Cole, who was turning out to be more observant than she'd initially given him credit for, seemed to have anticipated it. He was in the yard when she came out with Noah's hand in hers, fully dressed, her few things bundled under her arm. "Cabin's still frozen through," he said, without looking up from the harness he was working on. "It'll take 3-4 days of warmer weather before it's livable. We'll manage." "You said that before the blizzard, too." She stopped. He looked up then. His eyes were a pale, clear gray. She noticed that properly for the first time, and they were direct without being aggressive. He wasn't angry. He wasn't making a point to embarrass her. He just said it because it was true. "That's not fair," she said. "Maybe not, but your boy is warm and fed right now, and the cabin is not a place I'd leave a dog overnight in this weather." He set the harness down. "I'm not trying to take anything from you, Mrs. Mercer. I'm not asking for anything. I've got 2 kids myself and a house with extra rooms. The math isn't complicated. Noah, at Evelyn's side, was looking up at her. She wanted to argue. The argument formed itself in her chest. I don't take charity. I've managed on my own. I don't need... But she looked down at her son's face. He had color back in his cheeks that hadn't been there yesterday morning. His eyes were bright. There was a smear of jam on his chin from breakfast. She didn't finish the argument. 1 week, she said. Fine. I'll earn my keep. Cole picked up the harness again. Also fine. She turned to go back inside. Behind her, she heard him add almost to himself, most people don't argue this hard about not freezing to death. She kept walking, but something in spite of herself, she almost smiled. She found the quilting scraps on her second day. They were in a wooden crate in the corner of the room where she and Noah were sleeping. Old fabric, mismatched, clearly saved from worn-out garments and feed sacks over a period of years. Most people would have called them rags. Evelyn picked up a piece of blue flannel and held it to the light and felt the weight of it between her fingers and thought, usable. She had nothing to do. That was the problem. Evelyn Mercer did not know how to exist without work. She'd grown up in a household where idle hands were viewed with genuine suspicion, not as a moral failing exactly, but as a kind of waste. And now she was here, in someone else's house, eating someone else's food, and her body kept looking for a task. She found needle and thread in the bureau drawer, Hannah's probably, left for mending, and she sat down on the floor by the window with the crate of scraps, and she started to work. She wasn't sure what she was making at first. That was how she usually started, not with a plan, but with the fabric, letting the pieces suggest the pattern. A triangle of brown wool against a rectangle of green cotton, and then something in her saw how they fit together, and she followed that. By the end of the afternoon, she had the beginnings of a quilt top spread out on the floor. Noah came in from outside, red-cheeked and wild-haired, carrying a story about Danny showing him how to feed the horses and something about a chicken that had gotten loose. He saw her on the floor, surrounded by fabric, and immediately sat down beside her. "What's that going to be?" he asked. "A blanket." "For who?" "Don't know yet." He picked up a square of red gingham and looked at it seriously, the way he did everything. He was a child who gave most things more attention than adults expected. "Can I pick some pieces?" "Sure." He dug into the crate with both hands. Mchtet. Cole noticed the quilt 3 days later. It was finished by then. Not perfectly. There were seams that didn't quite align and one corner that pulled slightly, but it was warm and solid and the colors moved across it in a pattern that his eye kept returning to. She'd left it folded on the back of the sitting room chair. He stood there looking at it for a moment, the same way he'd stood at the window looking at the smoke that wasn't there. Just looking. "Noah picked the red pieces," Evelyn said from somewhere behind him. He turned. She was in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee. She'd been making coffee, he'd noticed, as a matter of habit, always keeping the pot fresh. A way of contributing that didn't require discussion. "It's well made," he said. "It's not perfect." "Didn't say it was." He picked it up and ran his thumb along one of the seams. "There's another crate of fabric in the barn. Old curtains, mostly. Some shirt material, I don't need any of it." She was quiet a moment. "I'll take a look." "Help yourself." He set the quilt back on the chair. Later that evening, after the children were in bed and the house had gone quiet, Evelyn sat alone by the fire with a new set of pieces laid out around her, and she was aware, without having asked for it, of something she hadn't felt in a long time. Not happiness, exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that didn't ask for anything in return. She didn't need to hear it directly. She was a woman who had grown up in a small county, and she understood exactly how these things worked. She saw it the first time Hannah's expression shifted when Evelyn mentioned going into town for supplies. Just the quickest tightening around the eyes, there and gone, before Hannah said, too easily, "I can pick up what you need, honey. No trouble." She heard it the first time Noah came back from an errand with Danny, and repeated, word for word, something a woman at the general store had said within his earshot. He was 6. He didn't know what it meant. He said it with the guileless precision of a child who is reporting the world as accurately as he can. She said, "It's a shame about the Mercer woman. They say she's set up permanent over at Ashford's." Evelyn kept her face very still. "What's set up permanent mean?" Noah asked. It means staying somewhere a long time, she said. Are we staying a long time? We're staying until the cabin is livable. He seemed satisfied with that and went off to find Danny. Evelyn sat down at the table and pressed her hands flat on its surface and stared at the grain of the wood. She had known this was coming. She'd known it from the first night, in the abstract way you know a storm is going to hit before the sky has actually changed. A widow staying in a widower's home. In Harlan County, in this year of our Lord, in a community that had opinions about everything and kept them all available for rapid deployment, this was not going to be met with silence. What she hadn't fully prepared herself for was how much it would sting. She wasn't doing anything wrong. She knew that. The logic of it was clear. She and Noah had nearly died. Cole had brought them somewhere warm, and now they were here because the alternative was going back to a frozen-through cabin with 4 pieces of wood. There was nothing improper about it, nothing that required defense. She knew all of that. It still stung. Cole heard about it on a Tuesday. He'd ridden into town to deal with a feed order, and he was at the counter at Dawson's Supply when Ed Hartley came in, a man Cole had known for 15 years, a decent man, the kind of man who genuinely meant well and sometimes meant well so hard it came out sideways. "Cole," Ed said. He had his hat in his hands. "Listen, people are talking. People are always talking." "No, but—" Ed glanced at the man behind the counter, then back at Cole, lowering his voice. "About the Mercer woman. Being at your place." Cole looked at him steadily. "She and her boy nearly froze to death. I brought them somewhere warm. That's the whole story." I know that. Ed turned the hat in his hands. "But it don't look right, Cole. A widow, living under your roof. Folks start wondering. Let them wonder. It reflects on you, Ed." Cole set his hand flat on the counter and looked at his old friend with the particular patience of someone who has already decided what he thinks about something. "I found a woman and a child dying in a cabin while their fire was cold and their food was gone. I brought them to my home. My children are there. My hired woman is there 3 days a week. There is nothing improper happening, and even if there were, it would not be the town's business." He picked up his feed receipt. "I'm not going to apologize for keeping people alive, not to you and not to anyone else." Ed was quiet for a moment. "You know who's going to make something of this?" "I know. Silas Crow's been making noise." Cole folded the receipt and put it in his shirt pocket. "Silas Crow makes noise about the weather. I'm not adjusting my life around his opinions." He picked up his hat from the counter. "Good to see you, Ed." He walked out. But in the wagon on the way home, he sat with the reins loose in his hands and his jaw tight, staring at the road ahead of him, and he thought about what he'd said and what it would cost. He didn't regret it. He also wasn't naive about what was coming. The 1 week became 2 without anyone saying so explicitly. The cabin was still not right. She'd ridden out to check it herself without telling Cole, and stood in the doorway and looked at the frost on the inside walls and the gap in the south-facing window frame where weather had gotten in over the fall. She stood there for about 5 minutes, then she rode back. At dinner that evening, Cole passed her the bread without looking at her, and she passed it to Noah, and Danny asked Clara something about whether she wanted the last of the gravy, and Clara said she didn't, but then immediately regretted it, and there was a brief negotiation that ended with them splitting it. It was so ordinary. That was the thing. It was a completely ordinary dinner, the kind that happened in houses where people had been living together long enough to know each other's habits. Danny knew to save Cole the heel of the bread. Clara knew that Noah would eat anything put in front of him and didn't need to be coaxed. Evelyn knew that the coffee had to be stronger than she personally preferred, or Cole would look at it with a specific expression that wasn't quite disappointment but was close. She knew these things after 2 weeks. She thought about that later when the children were in bed and she was alone in the room she shared with Noah, sitting on the edge of the mattress in the dark. She thought about how quickly people's habits became familiar, how fast a house stopped being unfamiliar, how a person could tell themselves 1 week and then look up and find themselves in the second week and realize that somewhere in between she'd stopped feeling like a guest. That scared her in a specific and not entirely unpleasant way. She pressed her palms together in her lap and sat very still and thought about Thomas, about the way he'd smelled in winter, wood smoke and cold air, and something underneath that she'd never found a name for, about his particular way of laughing, which started quietly and then took over his whole body if something got to him badly enough, about the fact that she had been managing, before the blizzard. Just barely. Just enough. She had been managing. She missed him in the flat, factual way of someone who has already done the acute stage of grief and arrived at something more like a permanent low-grade absence. Not a wound anymore. More like a missing tooth. You knew it was gone, you felt the gap, but you'd stopped being surprised by it. She lay down. Outside, the wind moved through the eaves and the house settled, and from somewhere down the hall, she could hear Cole's boots on the floor as he made his final round of the house before bed, checking the doors, checking the fire, checking the windows. She'd listened to it every night for 2 weeks without meaning to. She didn't know what to do with that, so she left it alone. The quilt orders started as a single comment. Hannah's sister-in-law came to visit, saw the blanket on the back of the chair, and picked it up with the look of someone who handled fabric regularly and knew the difference between a thing made well and a thing made perfectly. She ran her fingers along the seams. She held it up to the window. She asked, with the directness of a practical woman, how much Evelyn would take for it. Evelyn didn't have an answer to that. She hadn't made it to sell. "Name a price," Hannah's sister-in-law said. Evelyn named one that felt too high and was surprised when the woman accepted it without blinking. She made 2 more after that. Both sold before she'd fully finished them. Then 5 requests at once from different households, and she had to start making a list. It was strange what that felt like, having a list, having people want things she'd made. She'd always known she was good at it. You didn't quilt for 15 years without developing some honest understanding of your own abilities. But knowing you're capable of something and having the world confirm it are different animals entirely. She started working more seriously, started thinking about patterns more deliberately. She went through Cole's barn fabric and found the old curtains he'd mentioned, a deep burgundy that she could cut into solid squares, and she combined them with a pale yellow cotton from her own ruined summer dress, and produced something that, when she spread it out on the sitting room floor, made her sit back on her heels and look at it for a long moment. Danny came in, tracked it across it in socked feet, and said, "That's the nicest thing I've ever seen." "Don't walk on it," she said. "Sorry." He stepped off it. "Is it for sale?" "Yes." He considered this with the gravity of an 8-year-old assessing a business proposition. "How much?" She told him. His eyebrows went up. "Can I be your business partner?" Despite herself, she laughed. It came out more freely than she expected, and the sound of it surprised her. She'd gotten used to a version of herself that moved quietly and carefully through the world, and laughter felt like something she'd set down and forgotten to pick back up. "No," she said, "but I'll pay you to sweep the cutting room." He pointed out that there wasn't a cutting room. "There will be," she said, and found that she believed it. She wasn't looking for anything. She'd gone up to the attic because there was a box of old fabric that Hannah had mentioned, supposedly stored up there among the other things that had accumulated over the years of the Ashford household. She'd taken a candle, climbed the narrow stairs, and found the box after 5 minutes of careful navigation through the clutter of the accumulated past. She was on her way back to the stairs when she saw the trunks. There were 2 of them, old dark leather with brass fittings that had gone green with age. They sat together in the far corner of the attic in a way that wasn't random. They'd been placed there, arranged, as if someone had wanted to keep them together and also keep them out of sight. She should have kept walking. She set down her box and her candle and went to the nearer trunk. The latch was unlocked. She lifted the lid. The smell was the first thing, lavender mostly with something underneath, cedar, and beneath that the specific smell of cloth that has been folded and stored and not touched. A preserved smell. A smell that belonged to a different time. Inside the trunk, dresses. Not work clothes. Not the worn, practical garments of a woman who kept a ranch running. These were dresses. Sunday dresses. And a few that were finer than that. Occasion dresses. The kind a woman saves for things that matter. There was a dark green wool that had been carefully wrapped in cloth to protect it. A white cotton with eyelet trim at the collar. A deep blue silk that had been folded so carefully it had barely a crease after however long it had been here. These were Ruth Ashford's things. Evelyn sat back on her heels and looked at them for a long moment. She knew, objectively, that they were here. Knew the way you know any fact about someone else's life. At a distance, without texture. Cole's wife had died. That was a fact. That she had been real, that she had worn real dresses, and had her own particular smell and her own way of folding things. That was something different, something that the trunks in the attic made undeniable. She closed the lid carefully. She sat there in the dark attic with her candle throwing a small circle of light, and she thought about Cole's children. About Danny, who was 8 and had been 6 when his mother died. About Clara, who had been 3, which meant she had no real memory of Ruth at all. Just an absence in the shape of something she'd never be able to name. She thought about the way Danny sometimes went quiet in the middle of things. Just stopped, whatever he was doing, and looked at some middle point in the air between himself and the world. She thought about Clara, who had attached herself to Evelyn's side in a way that was both heartbreaking and uncomfortable to think about too carefully. She sat there for a long time, and then she opened the trunk again and looked at those dresses with different eyes, not as stored things, not as relics, but as cloth, as something that could still do what cloth does. She was going to need to talk to Cole. The conversation happened after dinner, when the children had gone up and the house had gone quiet. She found him at the kitchen table with a ledger book open in front of him, and he looked up when she came in. She stood in the doorway for a second, said, "I need to ask you something." He closed the ledger. She sat down across from him. She kept her hands folded on the table because she'd found over the last several weeks that she did this when she was about to say something important. It anchored her somehow, kept her from the nervous fidgeting that she'd always found embarrassing in herself. "I was in the attic today," she said. A brief pause. "For the fabric box?" "Yes. And I found—" She stopped, started over. "I found the trunks with your wife's things." His face didn't change, or rather, it changed in a way that was very controlled. The muscles at his jaw tightened very slightly. That was all. "I didn't go through them," she said quickly. "I lifted the lid of one. I wasn't trying to—" "It's all right. I want to ask you something, and I want you to know that you can say no, and I will absolutely respect that." He was looking at her steadily. "Go ahead." She took a breath. "The dresses in that trunk, some of them are beautiful fabric, and I was thinking—" She paused. "Danny doesn't sleep well. Clara wakes up at night, and I don't know if it would help, and it might not, and it might make things worse, which is why I'm asking you and not just doing it. But I thought, if I could use some of that fabric, the dresses, to make quilts for them. Quilts out of the things their mother wore. Things she touched." She stopped. Something they could keep. The kitchen was very quiet. Cole looked at the table. His hands were flat on it, and she could see the shape of them, work-scarred, broad across the knuckle, the hands of someone who had been doing physical labor for 20 years. He looked at them for a long moment. "You think it would help them?" he said. "I think it might. I'm not sure of anything." He was quiet again. Then, "Why would you want to do that? You didn't know her." The question was honest, not aggressive, not accusatory, just honest. He actually wanted to know. She thought about how to answer that. "Because they're your children," she said finally. "And they're still grieving, and I can see that even if no one talks about it out loud. And I know how to do this, and it costs me nothing, and it might give them something." She paused. "I'd be careful with it. I'd choose carefully, and anything I didn't use, I'd put back." He looked up from the table. He looked at her for a long moment with those clear, pale eyes, and she held herself still and waited for whatever he was going to say. "Yes," he said. She let out a breath. "Do what you think is right," he said. "I trust your judgment." She wasn't sure why that hit her as hard as it did. It was 4 words, simple words. But she walked back down the hall to her room feeling like something had shifted very slightly on its axis. And she sat down on the edge of the bed and pressed her hands to her eyes, and sat there in the dark for a while before she was ready to sleep. She worked on the quilts for a week. She didn't tell the children what she was making. She kept the material hidden, spread out in the attic itself, so there was no risk of either of them stumbling on it before it was done. Cole kept the children occupied. He was, she was learning, a man who knew how to be present with his kids in a way that didn't require words. He taught Danny to check the harnesses. He let Clara follow him through the barn on his morning rounds, and didn't rush her when she stopped to study something. Evelyn worked. The green wool dress became a deep, solid background. She cut it carefully, preserving every piece she could, and combined it with a cream-colored cotton that had been in the attic fabric box, something Ruth had never gotten to. possibly saved for a project that never happened. For Danny's quilt, she added a border of the white eyelet cotton from one of the nicer dresses, the Sunday dress, the one that would have been worn to town, to occasions, to things that mattered. For Clara's, she used the blue silk, just pieces of it, cut small and combined with others so it didn't overwhelm, because silk was delicate and hard to work with, but she knew how. She'd learned the technique from her grandmother. Clara's quilt was softer than Danny's, more color, less structure, because that was what you gave to a 5-year-old. She sewed at night mostly, after dinner, after the children were in bed, after the house went quiet. Sometimes she was aware of Cole still up somewhere in the house. She could hear him occasionally, moving around, and once she came out for water and found him at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee gone cold and a letter open in front of him that he folded quickly when she came in. "Sorry," she said. "Don't be." He picked up the cold coffee and looked at it. "You're up late. Almost done." He nodded. He didn't ask what she was doing. He already knew. "Does it—" she started, then stopped. "Does it what?" She considered. "Does it feel wrong to you? Using her things?" He was quiet for a moment. "Ask me again when I see them with it." He stood, poured the cold coffee out, rinsed the cup. "But right now, no. It doesn't feel wrong." He looked at her briefly. "It feels like something she would have done herself, if she'd thought of it." Evelyn didn't say anything. After a moment, Cole said, "She was good like that, thinking of ways to make things useful. She sounds like someone I'd have liked." He looked at her for a second. "Yeah," he said. "I think you would have." He went to bed. Evelyn stood at the kitchen window for a while, looking out at the dark, the snow blue and still in the moonlight. Then she went back to her sewing. She finished both quilts on a Thursday evening. She washed her hands, folded them carefully, and stood in the middle of the sitting room, holding one under each arm for a moment, just holding them, feeling the weight of them. Then she went and found Cole. She didn't make a ceremony of it. That felt wrong. This was not a ceremony kind of moment. She brought both children into the sitting room and sat them on the floor and gave each of them their quilt without explanation, just, "Here, this is for you." Clara unfolded hers immediately with both hands, the way she did everything, all at once, completely. She spread it out in her lap and then looked up at Evelyn with an expression that was half confusion, half something more complicated. "It's pretty," she said. "Your mama picked that blue," Evelyn said, "a long time ago." Clara looked back down at it. Her small hands moved over the surface of the fabric. Danny was slower. He unfolded his quilt carefully, the way he'd have handled something he wasn't sure about, and looked at the green wool background and the white eyelet border. He touched the eyelet with one finger. "That's her dress," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. "It is." His jaw moved. He was doing the thing 8-year-old boys do when they're fighting themselves. The thing where the lower lip trembles and they clamp down on it hard because they've already decided they're too old for crying, which they're not, but nobody's been able to convince them of that yet. Cole was in the doorway. Evelyn had forgotten he was there for a moment. She watched Danny's face, watched the battle happening in it, watched him lose. The first sob came out of him like something that had been locked up a long time and had run out of patience. He pressed the quilt to his face, just pressed it there, and shook. Not gracefully, not quietly. The kind of crying a child does when they've been holding something back for 18 months and finally, can't anymore. Evelyn sat very still. Cole moved into the room. He sat down beside his son and didn't say anything, just put his arm around the boy and held him while Danny cried into green wool that had once been his mother's Sunday dress. Clara watched her brother, then she looked down at her blue silk quilt. Then she lay down on the floor with it pulled up to her chin, in that completely unselfconscious way small children have, and closed her eyes. The sitting room was full of the sound of Danny crying, which slowly, over several minutes, quieted into the uneven breathing of a child who has exhausted themselves. Evelyn looked at Cole over the top of Danny's head. He was looking back at her. There was nothing to say. No words that wouldn't be too much or not enough. So neither of them said anything at all. It was the longest moment Evelyn could remember in a long time. Clara stopped waking up screaming on the 4th night after the quilts. Evelyn noticed because she'd grown accustomed to the sound, that sharp, high cry coming through the wall sometime around 2 or 3 in the morning, followed by the heavier sound of Cole's footsteps crossing the hall, his voice low and steady until the crying stopped. She'd been sleeping light enough to hear all of it without meaning to, and she'd lie there in the dark listening and feeling the particular helplessness of someone who wants to do something and has no right to. The fourth night was quiet. And the fifth. By the end of the week, she realized she'd slept through until morning 3 nights running, which was something she hadn't done since before Noah was born. She mentioned it to Hannah on a Wednesday while they were working in the kitchen together. Hannah was rolling out biscuit dough, and Evelyn was cutting squares for a new commission. A woman in the next county had sent word through her husband asking for something in blue and cream. "Clara's been sleeping," Evelyn said. It came out more careful than she intended, like she was testing the statement before committing to it. Hannah pressed the biscuit cutter down without looking up. "I know. Cole told me." A pause. "He said Danny asked to sleep with his quilt even on the warm nights." Evelyn kept cutting. The scissors made a clean sound through the cotton. "That boy's been carrying something heavy for a long time," Hannah said. "Since before Ruth passed, even, because children know when things are going wrong before anyone tells them." She lifted a round of biscuit dough and set it on the pan. "What you did, but that was a good thing. I want you to know somebody said that to you directly." Evelyn put down the scissors. She hadn't realized until that moment that she'd been waiting for someone to say exactly that. Not because she needed the validation, she knew what she'd done and why, but because there's a difference between knowing a thing and hearing it said out loud by another person who means it. The difference, it turned out, was larger than she'd expected. "Thank you," she said. The words came out rough around the edges. Hannah looked at her then, the same direct look she'd had that first day when she'd handed Evelyn a cup of broth and told her she was alive, and that was different from being all right. "You're not as easy to help as you look," she said. "What does that mean?" "It means you say thank you like it costs you something." Hannah slid the biscuit pan into the oven. "Which is fine, just an observation." Evelyn picked up the scissors again. Outside the window, she could hear Danny and Noah in the yard, something involving a lot of running, and at least one argument that was resolving itself without adult intervention. She'd noticed that about the 2 boys. They fought fast and got over it faster, with the practical efficiency of children who have too many other things they'd rather be doing. "It does cost me something," she said finally. Hannah didn't ask her to explain that. She just nodded once, like the answer confirmed something she'd already figured out, and started on the next batch of dough. The morning went on around them, ordinary and warm, and Evelyn kept cutting squares and thought about cost and what it meant to let herself be helped, and whether those 2 things were ever going to stop feeling like the same thing. They probably weren't, but she was starting to think that was all right. The trouble with getting comfortable somewhere was that the world outside kept moving, and it didn't adjust its pace to accommodate the fact that you'd found a temporary corner of it that felt bearable. Harlan County had opinions, and opinions in a small county didn't stay theoretical. They moved toward action with the slow, grinding certainty of a wheel finding its rut. She found out about the meeting from Marcus. He was the hired hand, the practical man with 2 missing fingers, and he had the particular quality of someone who absorbed information without comment and released it only when it seemed necessary. He found Evelyn in the barn one afternoon when she'd come to look at the remnants of a bolt of canvas that Cole had said she was welcome to, and he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and said, "Mrs. Mercer, you ought to know something." She looked at him. "Go ahead." "Silas Crow's been calling on people, going house to house." Marcus turned the hat slowly in his hands. "He's talking about a town meeting. Says there are community standards that need addressing." Evelyn stood very still. "He said my name." "Not to me directly, but it's not hard to figure out what standards he's addressing." Marcus put his hat back on. "I thought you should know before Cole told you, or before you heard it somewhere worse." "Does Cole know?" "He knows Crow's been making noise. I don't know if he knows about the meeting." She thanked him. He nodded, went back to what he'd been doing. She stood in the barn for a few minutes with the canvas bolt in her hands, not really seeing it. Silas Crow. She knew who he was the way everyone in Harlan County knew who he was. You didn't have to have dealings with a man personally to know his shape in a community. He ran the county's largest dry goods operation, sat on every committee that existed, and 2 that he'd created himself, and had the particular brand of public morality that required an audience to function. He wasn't the kind of man who did wrong things. He was more dangerous than that. He was the kind of man who decided what wrong things looked like, and then found them everywhere he pointed. She put the canvas back and walked to the house. Cole was at the kitchen table when she came in, and she could tell immediately from the set of his shoulders that he already knew. He was holding his coffee cup without drinking from it, which was a thing she'd noticed he did when he was thinking through something he didn't like. She sat down across from him. "Marcus told me," she said. He set the cup down. "I was going to tell you tonight." "How long have you known?" "About the meeting, 2 days. About Crow working toward something, longer than that." He looked at her directly. "It doesn't change anything." "Cole," she said his name with deliberate patience. "It changes things for you, for your children. Your reputation in this county is your livelihood. It affects who does business with you, who you can get credit from, who—" "I know what my reputation does," he said. "I also know what I did and why I did it, and I'm not going to pretend it was something else to satisfy Silas Crow. I could go back to the cabin." "The cabin's still not—" "I know it's not perfect. I'd manage." He looked at her with an expression that was very controlled and not entirely patient. "You said that before. You were nearly dead when I found you." "That was a blizzard. The weather's—" "Evelyn." He said her name the same way she'd said his, with the patience of someone who is making a deliberate effort. "I'm not asking you to leave. I'm not asking you to do anything. I'm telling you that a man with bad intentions and a loud voice doesn't determine what happens in my house, and I'd appreciate it if we could stop having this particular argument." She pressed her lips together. "You're angry," he said. "I'm not angry. You look angry. I'm frustrated. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" She thought about it for a second. Anger wants to fight someone. Frustrated just wants things to make sense. She looked at the table. "This doesn't make sense. We haven't done anything wrong, and we're going to have to defend ourselves for it anyway." "Yeah," he said. "That's usually how it goes." She looked up. He wasn't being cynical about it, just factual, in the way of someone who has been alive long enough to have noticed the pattern and stopped being surprised by it. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Go to the meeting. Tell the truth." He picked up his coffee. "What are you going to do?" She hadn't thought about that. She'd assumed, in some part of herself, that this was his problem to handle, that her role was to stay out of it, keep her head down, not make things worse. It was the calculation she'd been making since she arrived, the same math she'd been doing her whole adult life. Be small enough not to be a problem. Be useful enough to justify your presence. Take up as little room as possible. "I don't know," she said. He drank his coffee, didn't push it, left the question where she'd left it, like something she could come back to. That night, after everyone was asleep, she sat by the fire with a quilt in her lap that she wasn't really working on and thought about that question for a long time. What was she going to do? The order for the blue and cream quilt had arrived with a note from the woman who'd commissioned it, saying that her neighbor had seen a quilt of Evelyn's and wanted one as well. A second commission in the same message. Then, the following day, a separate inquiry from a woman in the town of Kelton, 15 miles east, asking about price and timeline. Evelyn had spread these notes on the table and looked at them with an expression she couldn't quite identify. Business. She was apparently in business. She'd been making quilts her whole life, but she'd never thought of it as a trade. It was something women did, something domestic, something that didn't exist in the category of work that got counted or compensated or taken seriously. Her mother had quilted, her grandmother. Every woman she'd grown up around had fabric and thread in her hands at some point, and nobody had ever suggested that this was something that could be sold, that it had a market value, that someone somewhere would pay money for it. The woman in Kelton was prepared to pay more than Evelyn had charged anyone else. She wrote back and said yes. She told Cole about it at breakfast because she'd decided that whatever was happening here, this arrangement, this temporary situation, this thing that didn't have a name, it worked better when she wasn't keeping things to herself. She'd spent too long keeping things to herself. Pride again, that old familiar trap. He looked at the notes without picking them up. "You're going to be busy." "I think so." Danny, across the table, said, "I asked to be her business partner. She said no." "She's smarter than me then," Cole said. "You don't have a business partner either." Danny said. No, but I've asked Marcus and he keeps declining. Cole passed Noah the butter. Keeps his options open. Noah, who didn't entirely follow the conversation but understood that a joke had been made, laughed at approximately the right moment. Clara copied him a second later, which was something she'd started doing recently, monitoring the room and mirroring its emotional register with the attentive precision of someone learning a language. Evelyn watched them around the breakfast table. She thought about how she'd been counting weeks. 1 week, then 2. She'd stopped counting after the third, which was itself a kind of information. The quilting took up her mornings. The house took up her afternoons. Noah was thriving in ways that made her throat tight when she let herself look directly at it. He'd been thin and quiet and too careful for a 6-year-old, and now he ran in the yard with Danny and came in at the end of the day with dirty knees and stories, and the stories kept getting longer and more elaborate, which meant he was happy. Happy children invented things. Worried children just reported them. She was worried about the meeting, but she was trying not to let it hollow out the days between now and then. The meeting was on a Friday evening in the main room of the Grange Hall in town. Evelyn had been to the Grange Hall for various county functions over the years. Harvest meetings, municipal announcements, the occasional social, and she knew it as a big cold room with benches that were never comfortable and a stove in the corner that heated 1/3 of the space and left the rest to fend for itself. She and Cole rode in together, not because of any statement they were trying to make. It was practical. They were going to the same place. But she was aware, as they crossed the county road into town, that people would see them arrive together and that this would be interpreted. Everything was being interpreted right now. She'd accepted that. The hall was more full than she'd expected. She'd been thinking maybe 30 people. There were at least 60, which meant word had spread further than just Crow's house-to-house campaign. There was the charged, slightly electric quality to the room that crowds get when they've come for something uncomfortable. People sitting close together, voices lower than normal. A lot of sideways looks at the door when they came in. Ed Hartley caught Cole's eye from across the room and gave him a nod that was hard to read. A few people she didn't know looked at her with frank curiosity. A woman near the front, somebody's wife, leaned to her neighbor and said something that she had no way to hear. She sat down next to Cole on the third bench from the back. Noah was at the ranch with Hannah, who had offered without being asked. Cole's children were there too. Evelyn had been grateful for that in a way she hadn't quite said out loud. Silas Crow was already at the front of the room. She'd seen him before at a distance, a tall man running to heaviness in the way of men who eat well and work little, with a broad, well-shaved face and the kind of posture that came from decades of being the largest presence in most rooms he entered. He had good clothes, well kept. He was the kind of man who understood the power of appearances, which made him, in some ways, the most dangerous kind of opponent for someone in Evelyn's position, because she'd always been on the wrong side of what appearances said about a person. The meeting was called to order by a man named Fletcher, who ran the county recorder's office and served as a kind of unofficial moderator for these things. He was uncomfortable, visibly, and Evelyn almost felt sorry for him. He was a decent man placed in an indecent situation, and he knew it, and the knowledge was all over his face. Crow spoke first. He was good at it. She'd give him that. He didn't shout, didn't bluster. He used the steady, reasonable voice of a man explaining an unfortunate necessity, and he laid out his concern with a kind of mournful precision that made it sound as though he'd been pushed to this moment against his will, as though the whole thing pained him deeply. The substance of it was what she'd expected: community standards, reputation of the county, the effect on young people of seeing certain behaviors go unaddressed, the danger of allowing exceptions to become precedents. He never said her name, which was almost worse. It left the accusation large and general in the room, something that could attach itself to her without the accountability of being directly spoken. She kept her hands flat on her knees and listened. Cole was very still beside her, the kind of still that wasn't passive. She'd come to recognize the difference. When Crow finished, Fletcher asked if anyone wanted to respond. There was a pause, the held breath kind, and then Cole stood up. He was not a man who made speeches. She knew that about him. He was not comfortable with this. She could see it in the set of his shoulders, the slight tension in his jaw. But he stood up, and he looked at the room, and he started talking. He told them what he'd found. He didn't dramatize it. He just said it plainly. A cabin with no fire and no food, and a woman and a child in the early stages of freezing, while the rest of the county had sat through the storm behind their own warm walls and never once thought to check. He said he'd brought them to his home, because that's what you do when someone is dying and you're in a position to help. He said his children were there, his hired woman was there, and that everyone who had been to his property since November could stand up and testify to the complete ordinariness of what was happening. I'm not going to apologize for it, he said. Not to this room and not to anyone else. Mrs. Mercer and her son are alive because I made a choice I'd make again tomorrow. He paused, just briefly. And I'd ask anyone here who would have made a different choice to think carefully about whether that's something they want to say out loud. He sat down. The room was quiet in a way that rooms get when something true has been said and everyone is calibrating their response to it. Evelyn stared at the back of the bench in front of her. Her hands were still flat on her knees. She could feel the blood in them. Fletcher said, carefully, that if anyone else wanted to speak, she stood up. She hadn't decided to. Or she had, and hadn't known it until her body did it for her, which was sometimes how decisions worked. She was standing, and the room was looking at her, and she opened her mouth. I want to say something, she said. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. I know what people have been saying. I know what this meeting is about, even if my name hasn't been said out loud. She looked at Crow when she said that. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who is patient and certain. I would have died. My son would have died. The fire had been out since the night before, and the wood was gone, and there was no one coming. She stopped. Let that sit for a second. Not because people in this county are bad people, because nobody checked, because everyone assumed someone else had it handled, or that we were managing, or I don't know. I don't know why nobody came. She looked at the room. Cole Ashford came. He fought through 4 feet of snow on horseback because he noticed there was no smoke from my chimney, and he came. And what I have heard since then from some of the same people who didn't come is that there is something inappropriate about the fact that I'm still alive because of it. Her jaw was tight. She unclenched it deliberately. I understand community standards, she said. I was raised with them. I believe in them. But I also know the difference between a standard that protects people and a standard that protects an idea about people. And what I'm hearing tonight is the second kind. She let her eyes move across the room. I'm not asking anyone to approve of my situation. I'm telling you the truth about it because Mr. Ashford told you the truth about it, and the truth is all there is to tell. She sat down. Her heart was going very fast. She pressed her hands together in her lap and looked straight ahead. Cole didn't say anything, but she felt him, very slightly, shift his weight toward her on the bench. Just a fraction of an inch. The smallest possible acknowledgement. She felt it anyway. The room held its silence for a moment more, and then something in it changed. Not dramatically. This was not the kind of room where things changed dramatically. It was more like air moving, like the temperature shifting by a degree, like something that had been held at a particular pressure, releasing the smallest amount. A woman near the middle stood up. Evelyn didn't know her name. She said plainly that she thought Mr. Crow had called this meeting for reasons that had more to do with his opinions about Cole Ashford's land deal from last spring than any concern about community standards, and that she, for one, was tired of the Grange Hall being used for personal business dressed up as civic concern. 2 men across the room laughed, the short, sharp kind of laugh that escapes when someone says the thing everyone was thinking. Crow stood up. His face had gone a color that didn't suit him. He began to say something about the seriousness of the matter, about what it meant for the county's reputation, about the responsibility of community leaders to— "Sit down, Silas," someone said from the back. Not cruelly, just done. He sat down. Fletcher called the meeting to an end shortly after. There was no formal resolution, no vote. It had come to nothing. The most complete kind of nothing, the kind that came from a room full of people deciding collectively that a thing wasn't worth their time. Crow sat at the front with his jaw rigid and his hands folded on his knees, and people filed past him on their way out with the deliberate non-acknowledgement of a county that had made up its mind. On the way out, Ed Hartley touched Cole on the arm. "Good," he said, which was all he said. Outside, the evening was cold and clear, the kind of cold that came with stars. She and Cole walked to the wagon without talking. He helped her up. She didn't protest it, which was itself a small thing she noticed. And he came around and climbed up, and they headed home through the dark. After a while, he said, "You didn't have to do that." "I know. You held your own in there." She looked at the road. "I was terrified." "You didn't look it. People don't always look what they are." He was quiet for a moment, then, "No, they don't." The wagon moved through the night, the horse's breath misting in the cold air, the stars overhead enormous and indifferent. The road home was familiar enough by now that she didn't have to watch for landmarks. She knew this stretch, the way it dipped before the creek, the stand of cottonwoods that marked the last turn. Familiar without being hers. That was still the shape of things. But she was here. She had stood up and said true things in a room full of people who hadn't expected her to, and she was still here, and her sun was warm at the ranch, and the stars above the frontier were the same stars they'd always been. That was enough for tonight. It had to be. The Grange meeting should have been the end of it. In a more reasonable county, or maybe just a more reasonable world, two people standing up and telling the truth in a public room would have settled the matter. People would have gone home, thought about it overnight, and moved on to the next thing that needed their attention. But Harlan County was not a more reasonable world, and Silas Crow was not the kind of man who absorbed a public embarrassment and converted it quietly into humility. He was the kind of man who filed it away and waited. Evelyn knew that. She'd known it driving home under the stars that night, sitting beside Cole in the cold dark with her hands folded in her lap. She'd known it in the particular way of women who had spent their lives learning to read the difference between a thing that's over and a thing that's only paused. So she didn't relax. Not completely. She kept working, kept her head level, kept the same careful distance from anything that could be misread. But she didn't leave either. That was its own kind of decision, and she knew it. February came in cold and stayed that way. The snow didn't deepen further, but it didn't melt either. It just sat on the landscape, hard and gray and permanent looking, the way winter gets when it's been around long enough to stop trying to impress anyone. The quilt orders kept coming. She'd set up a proper workspace by then, not a cutting room, as she'd half-jokingly told Danny, but a corner of the sitting room that was understood by everyone in the house to be hers between the hours of 8 and noon. The good light came through the east window in the morning, and she'd learned to use it. She had a system now. The commissioned work went in a specific pile, the experimental pieces in another, the fabric sorted by weight and color along the windowsill. She'd started keeping a small notebook. Prices, materials, names, dates things were promised, and dates they were delivered. She'd never kept a business notebook before. The first time she wrote Mercer quilts at the top of a page, she'd stopped and looked at it for a long moment. "What'd you write?" Noah asked. He was on the floor nearby, drawing something complicated on a scrap of paper that involved horses and what appeared to be a very dramatic cliff. "My name," she said. He looked up. "On what?" "A business page." He considered this. "Can I have a business page?" "What would you put on it?" He thought about it seriously. "Horse drawings. And a list of cliffs." "That's not a business." "It could be," he said, with the complete confidence of a 6-year-old who has not yet been educated out of believing everything is possible. She smiled at her notebook and didn't argue. The work itself was the steadiest thing in her days. There was a particular quality to the hours when she was deep in a piece, a narrowing of the world down to the thing in her hands, the way colors sat against each other, the decision about whether a seam needed to be pressed open or folded. It required just enough of her mind to keep everything else quiet. She'd always known that about quilting, but she'd never had reason to be grateful for it the way she was grateful for it now. One morning in mid-February, she was working on a commission for a woman named Adeline Morse. Blue and gold, simple pattern, queen size. When Cole came in from outside and stopped in the doorway of the sitting room, snow still on his coat, looking at the half-finished piece spread on the floor. "That's going to be something," he said. She was on her hands and knees, pinning a section. "It's getting there. The gold's fighting me." "How so?" She sat back on her heels. "The weight's different from the blue. When you wash it, the gold pulls tighter, so the seams shift. I have to account for it before it's done, not after." He came further into the room, unbuttoning his coat. He looked at the piece with genuine attention, not the polite kind. "You think about it that way. Before the problem shows up. You have to. By the time the problem shows up, it's harder to fix. Same with fence lines, he said, which surprised her. He saw that it surprised her. Bad fence line looks fine in summer, shows its problems in spring when the ground moves. He hung his coat on the hook by the door. You plan for what the material does under stress, not what it looks like standing still. She looked at him for a moment. I didn't know you thought about things that way. What way? Like a pattern, like there's a system underneath. He looked at the quilt again, then at her. Most things have a system underneath. You just have to be paying attention. He headed toward the kitchen. Coffee's still on? Should be. He disappeared down the hall. She turned back to her pinning. She was still thinking about what he'd said when she heard Danny come in from outside, stamping snow off his boots with the particular aggressive thoroughness of a child who's been told too many times to stop tracking in mud. Mrs. Mercer, Danny said, coming into the sitting room in his socked feet. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. He stood at the edge of the quilt. He was a boy who stood like his father, weight slightly back, like he was conserving something. Do you think about going back to your cabin? She looked up at him. He had an expression that was trying very hard to be casual and not quite making it. Sometimes, she said honestly. Would you? He asked. Go back? She set down her pins. This was the kind of question that deserved to be answered without a pin in her hand. It depends on a lot of things, Danny. Like what? Like whether the cabin is livable, whether it makes sense, whether... She stopped. Why are you asking? He looked at the floor. His jaw did the thing. Clara asked me where you were going when winter's over, and I didn't know what to tell her. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. What did you tell her? I said I didn't know. He looked up. She cried a little, not big crying, just... He made a vague gesture that communicated small, private grief with surprising accuracy. A little. She looked at this 8-year-old boy who was standing in the middle of her quilt work with his socks getting dusty, trying to manage his little sister's feelings about a future he couldn't predict. And something in her chest did something she didn't have a name for immediately. I don't have an answer yet, she said, but I'll tell you when I do, before I tell anyone else. You and Clara. He studied her. Promise? Yes. He nodded once, satisfied, and left the room. She listened to his footsteps go down the hall toward the kitchen, heard his voice. Dad, is there any of that cornbread left from yesterday? And heard Cole's answer, something low she couldn't make out. She picked up her pins. Her hands were not quite steady. The thing that had been building for weeks, the thing she'd been carefully not looking at directly, had just been named by an 8-year-old boy in socked feet, and now she couldn't unname it. She was part of something here. Not through design, not through any plan she'd made, but through the accumulation of ordinary days. Breakfast at the same table. Coffee made the same way every morning. The particular sound of this house at night, which she now knew as well as she'd known the sound of her own cabin. Better, maybe. She'd known her cabin the way you know a hard thing, from the inside through the effort of surviving it. This was different. She didn't know what to do with different. That was the honest truth of it. She was 30 years old, and she'd been a wife and then a widow, and she'd spent the last year learning to occupy less space in the world. And now there was a man down the hall who said things like, you plan for what the material does under stress, and 2 children who slept through the night with quilts she'd made from their mother's dresses, and a 6-year-old son on the floor drawing horses on cliff edges. She pressed a seam flat with her thumb and told herself to finish the section before she started thinking about anything else. She mostly succeeded. The shift happened slowly, the way shifts do when neither person involved is willing to acknowledge it directly. It wasn't one moment. It was the accumulation of smaller ones. Cole passing her the bread before she asked for it because he'd noticed she always wanted it with the soup and had stopped waiting for her to ask. Her noticing, without comment, that he ran his hand along the barn door frame every morning when he came in from the cold. Just a habit, a ritual. The kind of unconscious thing people do that you only notice after you've watched them do it enough times. They talked more than they had in the beginning. Not about large things. Neither of them seemed built for large things spoken outright. But about the small logistics of the day, about the children, about the work. He asked her once about a pattern she was developing, something more complicated than her usual commissions, and she found herself explaining the geometry of it, the way the angles had to relate to each other. and he listened with the specific quality of attention he gave things that genuinely interested him. "You learned this how?" he asked. "My grandmother. She learned from her mother, who learned it somewhere before that." She turned the pattern sketch toward him. "It's not mine. I just kept it." "You're making it yours." "Maybe," she considered, "or I'm making it the next person's. That's how these things work." He looked at the sketch for a moment. "Clara wants to learn," she'd noticed. Clara had started sitting near her during the morning work, watching with focused 5-year-old intensity, occasionally asking questions that were startlingly specific. "I know. I've been teaching her some basic things." Cole looked at her. "You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I'm doing it because she asked and I want to." She met his eyes. "Is that all right with you?" He held her gaze for a second. "Yeah," he said, "it is." It was somewhere in those weeks that Evelyn realized she'd stopped calculating the end of her stay. She couldn't have told anyone exactly when it happened, when she'd stopped keeping a mental account of days and started just living through them. But she noticed it one evening when she was going to sleep, the way you notice the absence of a sound you'd gotten so used to you'd stopped hearing it. The calculation was gone. She wasn't sure what that meant. She was fairly sure it meant something. March arrived with a thaw that felt tentative, like the world wasn't entirely sure it was ready to commit to warmth yet. The snow softened. The creek ran again. The mud came back with the particular enthusiasm it always had after a long winter, coating everything and requiring a level of vigilance about boots that temporarily became the main topic of conversation in the Ashford household. She went to check the cabin on a Tuesday. She went alone, told Cole she was going, took the horse he'd been letting her use, and rode the 2 miles south along the creek road. The cottonwoods had the faint green haze of buds coming. The sky was high and pale, and the air had the thin, clean smell of early spring, the kind of smell that felt like a fresh start whether you wanted one or not. The cabin sat in its crease between the hills, unchanged. She tied the horse and walked to the door and went in. It was better than January. The frost was gone from the walls, the gap in the south window still present but no longer catastrophic with cold. It was dark and musty, and the hearth had a winter's worth of disuse in it. The floor needed sweeping, the mattress needed airing. There was a smell that required open windows and time. She stood in the middle of it and looked around. It was a small space. She'd never thought of it as small before. It had been her home, and home doesn't feel small when it's the only size you know. But she had been living for 3 months in a house with 4 rooms that got used, with a kitchen that was designed to feed a family, with a porch wide enough to sit on in the evenings. She looked at the hearth. She looked at the spot on the floor where she'd been sitting with Noah pulled against her, counting the hours. She thought about Thomas. This had been their place. His first, then theirs. He'd built the shelving on the east wall himself, with lumber he'd hauled from town in pieces. It was still there, solid. He'd done good work. She ran her hand along the shelf edge and stood there for a while. Then she went back outside into the tentative March sun and untied the horse and rode home. She got back to find a letter waiting for her. Hannah had set it on the table with the deliberate placement of someone who thinks a thing might be important. It had come with a writer from Kelton, addressed in a handwriting she didn't recognize. Firm, slanted, economical. She opened it. The woman from Kelton, the one who'd commissioned the quilt back in February, had a sister in the county seat, 40 miles east. The sister ran a dry goods and general store. She had seen the Kelton quilt and was writing to ask whether Evelyn would be willing to supply quilts for sale on consignment through the store. She described the arrangement, the terms, the percentage. The letter was businesslike and correct, and ended with the observation that the demand for quality quilts in the county seat was, in her estimation, significantly underserved. Evelyn read it twice. Then she sat down. Then she read it a third time. The county seat, 40 miles. Consignment meant she didn't have to be there. She just had to make them, and they'd sell them, and she'd get a share of each sale. She could make quilts. She was already making quilts. She made them every day, had orders stacking up, was running out of hours. This was just more, different in scale. The same work, but with a wider reach. She was still sitting with the letter when Cole came in. He read her face before he read the letter. "What is it?" She handed it to him. He read it standing up, which was how he read most things. When he finished, he set it on the table and looked at her. "That's significant," he said. "Yes." "You're going to say yes?" It wasn't quite a question. She looked at him. "Is that obvious?" "You've got the look?" He sat down across from her. "The same one you had when you figured out the gold fabric problem." She almost laughed. "I didn't know I had a look." Most people don't know their own faces. He turned the letter in his hands. "The terms are fair. You'd need more material and more time than you have in the mornings." "I know. I could clear out the room off the kitchen. It's not being used. Better light than the sitting room, and it's bigger." She went still. "Cole, I'm not doing anything except pointing out a room. You're offering me a work room. It's an unused room. You could use it. That's all I'm saying." He set the letter down. "Or not. It's your decision." She looked at him. He was looking at the letter, which meant he was deliberately not looking at her, which she'd come to understand was something he did when he'd said something that mattered and didn't want to oversell it. "Thank you," she said. He looked up then, briefly. "Don't do that thing where you make it into more than it is." "I'm not." "You are. I can tell by how careful you said it." She pressed her lips together. "You're very observant." "It's a problem sometimes," he said. His mouth moved very slightly at the corner. Not quite a smile, but related to one. He stood up, picked up his hat from the table, and headed for the door. "I'll clear the room this week. I haven't said yes to the letter yet." "I know." He put his hat on. "But you will." He went outside. She looked at the letter on the table. Outside the window, she could hear Noah and Danny in the yard. Noah's voice rising with the particular pitch it reached when a game was at a critical juncture. And somewhere behind that, the sound of Clara singing something to herself, low and tuneless and completely absorbed. Evelyn picked up the letter. She thought about the cabin, about the shelf Thomas had built, about the floor where she'd sat counting hours, about the smell of it today. Not tragic, just abandoned, a place waiting to be decided about. She thought about the room off the kitchen with its better light. She thought about Cole standing in the doorway saying it's an unused room in that particular voice, the one he used when he was being deliberately matter-of-fact about something he actually cared about. She found a piece of paper, found her pen, wrote back to the woman in Kelton, to her sister in the county seat, in clear and business-like language that she was pleased to accept the arrangement and would have the first delivery ready within the month. She sealed the letter before she could think about it too much. Then she sat in the kitchen in the March light and listened to the children outside, the tentative warmth of early spring pressing against the window glass, and let herself be still for a moment inside a life that wasn't quite what she'd planned and wasn't quite what she'd lost and was somehow becoming its own thing entirely. She didn't know yet what to call it. She realized, less afraid of that than she used to be. The room off the kitchen turned out to have a broken window latch that let in a draft from the northwest, a floorboard near the door that needed renailing, and approximately 40 years of accumulated storage that had to be moved before any of it could be useful for anything. Cole spent a Saturday on it. Evelyn offered to help, and he said he had it. Then Marcus showed up, and between the two of them, they cleared the room in about 3 hours, moving boxes and broken tools and 2 crates of mason jars and a butter churn with a cracked handle out to the barn. Cole fixed the window latch himself, cut a shim for the floorboard, and rehung the door so it closed evenly instead of dragging. She didn't say anything about it. She just moved her fabric and her notebook and her pins into the room on Sunday morning and set up her workspace in the good south light, and when Cole walked past the open door around noon and glanced in, she was already deep in the blue and cream pattern she'd been developing for weeks, and the room looked like it had always been used for this. He kept walking, but he slowed just slightly as he passed, and she noticed. The county seat order changed things in ways she hadn't fully anticipated. It wasn't just the scale. More quilts, more material, longer hours. It was something about the legitimacy of it. She had a business arrangement with a real establishment in a real town, spelled out in writing with terms she'd negotiated herself, and that was a thing that existed in the world independent of anyone's opinion of her personal situation. Adeline Morse came by in the 3rd week of March to collect her commission and stayed for coffee, and ended up spending 2 hours looking at Evelyn's work and asking questions with the sharp, appreciative attention of someone who knew fabric. She was a tall woman, angular, the kind of person who moved through the world at a brisk pace and expected it to keep up. She picked up one of the half-finished pieces, turned it over, examined the back. "Your seams are cleaner than anything I've seen out of a home," she said. It wasn't a compliment exactly, more like a fact she was entering into the record. "I've had time to practice," Evelyn said. "You've had more than practice. You've got an eye." Adeline set the piece down. "My sister's going to sell everything you send her inside a week. You know that." "I don't know that." "I do." She picked up her coffee cup. "You should charge more." Evelyn had been about to say something and stopped. I quoted her a price. Quote her a different one for the next batch. "She'll pay it." Adeline looked at her over the rim of the cup. "Women undersell themselves. We do it because we think if the price is low enough, nobody can say we're getting above ourselves. But cheap work just means people don't take it seriously." She set the cup down. "Take it seriously first. They'll follow." Evelyn looked at her. "That's advice I didn't ask for," she said. "I know." Adeline didn't appear concerned about that. "It's still good advice." She raised the price in the next letter to Kelton. She did it without explaining herself, just stated the new price per piece with the confidence of someone who had been doing this for years. She sent the letter before she could second-guess it. The response came back in 4 days. Agreed, and could she do 6 pieces instead of 4 for the first delivery? She read that letter standing in the workroom doorway, and then she went into the kitchen, poured herself a cup of coffee, and stood at the window for a long moment, looking at the yard where the mud was finally starting to dry out in the April sun. 6 pieces. She could do 6 pieces. It was around this time that Silas Crow made his second move. She'd been expecting something. She told herself she wasn't. Told herself the Grange meeting had settled it, that a man in his position knew when a battle was finished. She'd been wrong about that. Or maybe she'd been right, and he'd decided the battle wasn't finished, which amounted to the same thing. She heard about it through Hannah, who heard it through her brother-in-law, who did business with 2 of the men on the county board. Crow had filed a formal complaint, not with the Grange this time, with the county land office, raising a question about the legal status of Evelyn's arrangement at the Ashford property. He'd framed it as a concern about land use and household registration, wrapped the whole thing in enough administrative language that it was hard to see clearly what he was actually doing, which was trying to find a way to force her out that didn't require a room full of people agreeing with him. Cole found out the same day she did, from a different source. He came in from town that evening with it already sitting in his face, that controlled, tight-jawed stillness, and he set his hat on the table and sat down and told her what he'd heard without preamble. "He's filing with the land office," he said. "I know. Hannah told me." He looked at her. "How long have you known?" "About 4 hours longer than you." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm going to talk to a lawyer in Kelton. I already wrote to one." She'd done it that afternoon, the same focused efficiency she brought to a complicated pattern. "His name is Warren Hale. He handled Thomas's estate. He's good." Cole looked at her for a second with an expression she couldn't fully read. "You move fast. You said yourself, plan for what the material does under stress." Something crossed his face. "I did say that. It turns out it applies to more than quilts." He almost smiled. Not quite, but almost. The thing about Crow's legal approach was that it was the kind of maneuvering that took time. Time to file, time to process, time for responses to work through the appropriate channels. It wasn't a crisis. It was a slow pressure, the kind designed to wear a person down rather than knock them over, and it required a different kind of resistance than the Grange meeting had. Less fire, more patience. Evelyn had patience. She'd been developing it for years. Warren Hale wrote back in 10 days. His assessment was that Crow's complaint had no clear legal foundation. Evelyn was a guest on private property with the property owner's full consent, and there was no statute that gave the county board authority over that arrangement. He recommended a formal written response stating this plainly, which he would draft on her behalf, and suggested that a counter-complaint about the misuse of land office resources for personal disputes might also be worth considering. She wrote back and said yes to both. She told Cole what Hale had said over dinner, with the children present, because she'd decided some time ago that protecting them from all evidence of the difficulty outside this house was not actually protection. It was just a different kind of unprepared. Danny was old enough to understand that a man in town had been causing trouble. Clara was 5, and mostly interested in whether there was more butter. "So the lawyer says Crow's wrong," Danny said. "The lawyer says Crow doesn't have a legal basis for the complaint," Evelyn said. "That's not exactly the same thing." Danny thought about this distinction with the seriousness he gave most things. Is there a difference? "Being wrong and being unable to prove you're right are different problems," Cole said. He was cutting his meat with the economical focus he brought to most physical tasks. "Crow's not wrong because a lawyer said so. He's wrong because what he's doing is wrong. The lawyer just gives us the tools to say so in a language the county board understands." Danny absorbed this. "That seems complicated." "Most true things are," Cole said. Noah, who had been following the conversation with the careful attention he brought to adult discussions he only partly understood, said, "Is the man going to make us leave?" The table went quiet. Evelyn looked at her son. He was watching her with those serious, careful eyes, the eyes that had been watchful from the time he was very small, like he'd learned early that the world required monitoring. "No," she said, "he's not." "How do you know?" "Because we're not doing anything wrong, and because we're not going to let him." Noah looked at Cole. "Are you scared of him?" Cole set down his fork. He looked at Noah with the same directness he used with everyone, including adults. "No," he said. "But I take him seriously, which is different. You don't have to be scared of something to respect what it can do." Noah thought about that for a moment, then picked up his fork and went back to his dinner, apparently satisfied. Clara asked again about the butter. The formal response went to the land office in the second week of April. Hale had drafted it in the careful, precise language of someone who knew how to make a point without raising a voice, and it laid out, methodically and without drama, exactly why Crow's complaint had no legal standing and exactly what remedies existed if the complaint was pursued further without justification. Crow withdrew it 10 days later. No announcement, no acknowledgement. The complaint simply ceased to be active, the way fires go out when you stop feeding them. She found out from Hale, who sent a brief note saying the matter was resolved and billing her for his time. She paid the bill immediately from the money she'd made on the first county seat delivery. That felt important. Paying a lawyer to defend her standing, from money she'd made herself for work that existed because she'd built it from nothing. The accounting of it had a particular satisfaction, not triumph exactly, more like completion. The closing of a loop. She put the receipt in her notebook. April moved into May with the slow, undeniable purpose of a season that has been waiting long enough. The cottonwoods along the creek road leafed out fully. The mud dried to solid ground. The air lost the last of its winter edge and started carrying warmth again, real warmth, the kind that reached into things. Evelyn's cabin was livable. She'd ridden out twice more to check it, and she'd been honest with herself each time about what she saw. With the window resealed and the hearth cleaned out, it was a small, functional shelter. The shelf Thomas had built was still solid. The floor was sound. A week of airing would take care of the smell, and some work on the yard before summer would prevent it from being completely overtaken. It was livable. She sat with that fact the way you sit with something you've been not quite looking at. It was livable, which meant the reason for being at the Ashford Ranch, the practical, defensible, beyond argument reason, was no longer as clear as it had been in January. She hadn't told Cole yet. She'd known for 2 weeks that the cabin was livable, and she hadn't said it out loud to him, and she was aware of what that silence meant. She told herself she was waiting for the right moment. She understood that she was probably waiting for the right nerve. The children complicated it. Not as an excuse, she was honest enough with herself not to use Danny and Clara as cover for what was actually her own uncertainty. But it was real, what Danny had asked in January, and what Clara's small, private grief had meant, and what she saw in those 2 kids every day when she moved through the house they lived in. She'd kept her promise to Danny. She hadn't told anyone else before she told him. She found him in the barn one afternoon, where he'd been helping Marcus with the saddle oil. She waited until Marcus went for something, and then she sat on the fence rail and said, "Danny, I told you I'd tell you first." He went still. He was holding a rag with saddle oil on it, and he looked at her, and she could see him reading her face the way his father read things. "The cabin," he said. "It's livable now. I went out and checked." He nodded slowly. His jaw did the thing. "When?" "I don't know yet." That was the honest answer. "I haven't decided. I'm telling you because I said I would." He was quiet for a moment, working something through. "Does my dad know?" Not yet. He looked at the rag in his hands. Are you going to tell him? Yes. Tonight? Probably. Danny rubbed the oil into the leather with more focus than it required. He was quiet long enough that she thought he was done talking, and then he said without looking up, Clara's going to take it hard. I know. I will too. He said it matter-of-factly, the way his father stated true things. In case you wanted to know that also. Her throat did something. She kept her voice steady. I did want to know that. He nodded and went back to the leather. She found Cole on the porch after dinner, when the light had gone golden long across the yard and the children were inside. He was sitting on the steps with a cup of coffee gone cold, the way he did sometimes in the evenings when the day was winding down and he was letting it go. She came and sat beside him on the step, not in the chair. On the step, which was the informal position, the one that meant she wasn't making an announcement. The cabin's livable, she said. He didn't respond immediately. He looked at the yard. Since when? 2 weeks. He absorbed that. The pause he took told her he'd noticed the gap between the fact and the telling. Okay, he said. I haven't decided anything yet. You needed to know. I appreciate that. He turned the cup in his hands. What are you thinking? I don't know yet. She looked at the yard too. The evening light was doing something complicated to the grass, turning it colors it wasn't during the day. I think about the cabin, and I think about here, and I don't know what the right answer is. There might not be a right answer, he said. Might just be a decision. That's not a comforting thought. Wasn't trying to comfort you, just saying what's true. She looked at him. He was looking at the yard, his profile in the evening light. The lines of his face were familiar to her in a way that had happened without her quite noticing. The particular set of his jaw, the way he held his shoulders when he was tired. She knew those things. Knew them the way you know the face of someone you've been looking at long enough for it to stop being a face and become just a person. Cole. He turned and looked at her. She stopped. Started again. I want to be clear about something. Whatever I decide about the cabin, it's not about here. About whether here is... She stopped again. The sentence had too many places to go wrong. I've been careful. I've tried to be. To not make this into something you didn't invite. He was looking at her with that direct, still attention. I invited you in out of a blizzard, he said slowly. Everything after that... He paused. I did not invite it. She looked at him. That's almost not a sentence, she said. I know. His mouth moved. The almost smile. I'm saying it the best way I can. The evening settled around them. Somewhere inside the house, Clara was saying something to Noah in the particular tone she used when she was explaining something she'd only just figured out herself. One of the horses shifted in the barn and the sound carried in the still air. Evelyn looked back at the yard. I need a little time, she said, to figure out what I'm doing. Take it, he said. That's not a problem. You're very patient. I've been patient about most of the important things in my life. He drank the cold coffee and made a small face at it. Haven't always been right about what was important, though. He stood up, brushed off his knees. You want fresh coffee? Yes. He went inside. She sat on the step alone in the evening light and looked at the ranch, the barn, the yard, the line of cottonwoods along the creek, and thought about the cabin 2 miles south with its solid shelves and its survivable rooms and its manageable, independent smallness. She thought about 6-piece quilt orders and lawyers named Warren Hale and advice about raising prices and a workroom with south light and a boy in a barn telling her matter-of-factly that he would take it hard. She thought about a man who had ridden 2 miles through chest-deep snow because there was no smoke from a chimney. She didn't have an answer yet, but she understood sitting there in the last of the evening that the question she was actually asking herself had almost nothing to do with the cabin anymore. She made her decision on a Wednesday morning in the middle of May, and like most real decisions, it didn't arrive as a thunderclap. It arrived the way the thaw had arrived, quietly, incrementally, until one day the ground was simply soft and there was no pointing to the exact moment it had changed. She was in the workroom when it happened. Early morning, the south light coming in flat and clean the way it did before the sun climbed high enough to angle it. She was piecing together the 7th commission of the season, a complicated pattern she'd designed herself, concentric diamonds in 4 shades of brown and 1 deep red. And she was thinking about the seam allowances on the inner ring when it simply settled in her. She wasn't going back to the cabin, not because she couldn't. She could. It was livable. It was hers. It had Thomas's shelves and her own history in its walls, and no one could tell her otherwise. She could go back, and she could run her business from there, and she could manage. She'd been managing most of her adult life, and she was good at it. But managing and living were different things. She'd known that since January, since Hannah had said it over a cup of broth on the first day. "You're alive. Those are different things, honey." She put down the piece she was working on. She sat on the stool in the south light for a long moment with her hands in her lap, not doing anything, just letting the decision be real. Then she went to find Cole. He was in the east pasture, fixing a section of fence that had heaved over the winter. She could see him from the yard, the familiar set of his shoulders, the way he worked with focused, economical movements, no wasted motion. Marcus was nearby, but they weren't talking. They worked in the comfortable silence of 2 people who'd been working together long enough that conversation was optional. She walked out to the pasture. The grass was thick now, properly green, and the morning air still had enough cool in it to make the walk pleasant. She came up beside him and he looked at her once, and then back at the fence post he was examining. "You have a decision face," he said. "Is it different from my regular face?" "Yeah, your jaw's different." He pressed on the post, still loose. He picked up the digger. "What is it?" She'd thought about how to say this on the walk over and hadn't arrived at anything better than the plain version. "I'm not going back to the cabin." He stopped digging. She kept going because she'd learned that with Cole, you had to say the whole thing before he'd respond, and if you left a gap, he'd fill it with something practical, and she didn't want something practical right now. "Not because I can't, because I don't want to, because this is where my work is, and this is where Noah is happy, and this is where—" She stopped. "I'm not going back because I don't want to leave." He was looking at her now. The fence post digger was still in his hands. "That's the honest version," she said, "in case you wanted it." He set the digger down against the fence post. He looked at her for a moment with that direct, unhurried attention that she'd come to understand was just how he looked at things he was taking seriously. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to answer it honestly, not carefully." Those are sometimes the same thing. "Not with you, they're not." He looked at the fence line for a second, then back at her. "Are you staying because it makes sense? Or are you staying because you want to be here?" The question sat between them in the morning air. She understood what he was actually asking. He was asking whether she was making a logical calculation, workroom, orders, children, convenience, or whether she was saying something more than that. He was asking, in the most careful and indirect way possible, whether what had been building between them for 5 months was part of the answer. "Both," she said. "Is that allowed?" "Depends on which one's doing most of the work." She looked at him. "The second one," she said, "if you want the honest version." He was quiet for a long moment. A meadowlark somewhere in the grass was going through its whole repertoire, indifferent to the human standing in the pasture, not talking. "Evelyn," he said. The way he said her name had changed at some point. She'd noticed it without marking exactly when. Less careful, more direct, like he'd stopped being cautious about it. "I've been trying to give you room, to figure things out without me making it harder. I know you have, but I'm going to say something now, and I'd rather say it wrong than not say it." He looked at the fence post, then at her. "I don't want you to leave. I haven't wanted you to leave since about the 3rd week you were here, and I've been making a significant effort not to make that your problem." He picked up the fence digger again, then seemed to realize he didn't need it and put it back down. "Noah fits here. You fit here. And He stopped. "This house has been better with you in it. Not just easier. Better. And I don't think that's nothing." She didn't say anything immediately. She'd waited a long time to hear something honest from another person. Not flattery, not obligation, not the gentle management of a man who felt responsible for a woman in a difficult situation. Just something true, stated plainly, with no performance around it. "It's not nothing," she said. "No. I'm not the same person I was before Thomas died. I want you to know that because it matters. I'm harder in some ways. I'm less willing to be small about things. I have opinions about business now, and I'll argue about them." She met his eyes. I'm not looking for someone to take care of me. I can take care of myself. I noticed that about you, he said. It's not a problem. I'm just saying it plainly. I heard you, the almost smile. I'm not looking to take care of you either. I had someone to take care of, and I lost her, and that... He stopped, looked at the pasture for a second. That taught me that taking care of someone and loving someone aren't the same thing. And I spent a long time mixing them up after Ruth died, and I'm done mixing them up. He looked back at her. I'm not asking you to need me. I'm asking if you want to stay. The meadowlark was still going. Yes, she said. I want to stay. He nodded once. All right. That's all you're going to say? What do you want me to say? She thought about it. Nothing. That's actually the right amount. The corner of his mouth moved. I'll work on the cabin, he said. It should be fixed up properly whether you use it or not. Thomas built that shelf well. House deserves better than being left to fall apart. She looked at him. You're going to fix his house. It's a good house. Needs attention. He picked up the fence digger, finally using it. Help me with this post and then we can go back. She took the other handle and they worked the post back to vertical together. And it wasn't a ceremony or a declaration. It was just two people doing a practical thing side by side, which was, she thought, exactly the right way for this particular moment to end. She told the children that evening. She thought about waiting, about finding a formal moment, but formal moments in this house were rare and slightly awkward for everyone involved. So she told them at dinner simply, she was going to stay, if that was all right with them. Danny looked at his plate for a second, and she could see him working to keep his face arranged. He was getting better at that, the emotional management of a boy who'd decided he was old enough to handle things. He wasn't entirely, but he was practicing. Yeah, he said. That's all right. Clara, who had no investment in appearing composed, climbed off her chair and wrapped both arms around Evelyn's arm and pressed her face against her shoulder and stayed there for the rest of the meal, occasionally reaching for her fork without letting go. Noah looked at Cole. Does that mean we're staying? It means your mother's decided, Cole said. Seems like you're with her. Noah processed this with his characteristic deliberateness. Is that good? What do you think? Evelyn asked him. He thought about it honestly, as he thought about everything. Yeah, he said, with the simple confidence of a child who has decided something is true and sees no reason to complicate it. I think it's good. The summer that followed was not uncomplicated. Real life had the decency to stay real. There were mornings when Evelyn and Cole irritated each other in the specific ways that people who are learning to share a life will inevitably find. He had a way of making decisions about the ranch without consulting her that she found, on 3 separate occasions, genuinely infuriating, and she told him so directly the third time, and he looked at her with something between surprise and respect and said he'd work on it. She had a way of going silent when she was worried instead of saying she was worried, and he'd told her with equal directness that it was hard to help with something if she didn't tell him it was happening. These were not elegant conversations. They were the slightly clumsy, slightly uncomfortable conversations of two people who came to each other fully formed and had to learn to account for each other, which was harder in some ways than starting young and growing up together, and more interesting in others. She kept the workroom. The county seat orders became a reliable monthly income. Adeline Morse had been right. She'd raised her prices twice more by July, and the demand, rather than dropping, seemed to follow the prices up, as though the world was waiting to be told the work was worth something before it decided to agree. She hired a girl from town, 15 years old, to help with the cutting work 3 mornings a week, which freed her for the piecing and the finishing that required her specific hands. She went to the cabin once more in June, with Cole, to assess what needed doing. They walked through it together, and he pointed out the structural things, the roof corner that needed support, the foundation on the north side that had settled, and she pointed out what she'd do with the interior if they fixed it up. She didn't know why she was talking about the interior. The cabin wasn't going to be her home, but she talked about it anyway, and Cole listened and made notes, and they ended up spending an hour in the small space talking about walls and light and what the place could be. And by the time they left, she understood that they were going to fix it up, not because anyone needed to live in it, but because it was the right thing to do for a house that had been a home. Thomas would have appreciated that, she thought. He'd been particular about things being done right. The question of marriage came up in August, obliquely at first and then directly. It came up obliquely because Hannah mentioned, without quite being asked, that two households running as one household, without being officially one household, created certain administrative difficulties with respect to property law and inheritance. And she said this in the particular tone of someone who is delivering information that has been requested by neither party, but is being delivered anyway out of genuine concern. Evelyn thanked her without quite meeting her eyes. It came up directly because Cole asked her. He asked her on a Sunday evening in late August, when the heat had finally broken, and there was something that felt almost like fall in the air, that tentative first cool that hints at the season coming. They were on the porch, the same porch steps where they'd sat in April, and he'd said, "I didn't not invite it." She'd thought about those words more than once in the intervening months. He said, "I think we should get married." She looked at him. "That's not quite a question." "No," he agreed. "Is it all right if I ask it as a statement?" "Depends on what you mean by it." He turned on the step to face her more directly. This was not a man who was comfortable with this kind of conversation, and he wasn't pretending to be, which she valued. His hands were on his knees, and she could see him working out the words, not because he didn't know what he meant, but because he was being careful to say it exactly right. "I mean, I want you here, not as a situation, not as an arrangement that made sense in January. I want you here because this is where you belong, and because I'm better with you than without you, and I've been alone long enough to know the difference." He paused. "And because the kids are yours as much as they're mine at this point, whether we make it official or not, and I'd rather it be official." He looked at her steadily. "And because I love you," which I probably should have led with. She was quiet. "You probably should have led with it," she agreed. "I was building up. I noticed." She looked at the yard in the evening light. She thought about January, about the cold floor and Noah pressed against her chest, and the counting of hours. She thought about the way the world could turn on a single choice. A man looking at a horizon, noticing an absence, and deciding that absence mattered. She thought about all the small choices after that, hers and his both, that had accumulated into the particular shape of this evening. She thought about Thomas. She let herself think about him, clearly and without flinching, the way she'd learned to do over the last year. She thought about the shelf, and the way he laughed, and the fact that she had loved him and lost him, and that losing him had not been the end of her, even though for a long time it had felt like it might be. That was the thing nobody told you. Loss didn't end you. It changed you, took things from you, left gaps that didn't fill back in. But it didn't end you. You kept going, and eventually, not quickly, not cleanly, you found out who you were after. This was who she was after. A woman with a business and a workroom and a boy who drew horses on cliff edges, a woman who raised prices without apologizing for it and stood up in rooms full of people and said true things, a woman who had learned the difference between managing and living and had decided finally to live. "Yes," she said. Cole let out a breath she didn't think he'd been aware he was holding. "Yeah?" "Yes." She looked at him. "Did you think I was going to say no?" "I wasn't sure." He rubbed the back of his neck. "You keep me from being sure about things. I've noticed that." "Is that a complaint?" "No." He dropped his hand. "It's actually, no. It's not a complaint." They sat on the porch steps for a while longer in the gathering dark, not talking much, which was the right way to sit after something important has been said and doesn't need to be said again. The wedding was in September, small by choice. Evelyn had no interest in performance, and Cole had even less, and they'd agreed without discussion that what mattered was the fact of it and not the occasion around it. There were about 20 people: Hannah and her husband, Marcus and his wife, Adeline Morse, Ed Hartley and his family, a few others from the county who had stood on the right side of things when sides were being chosen. Danny stood beside his father. Clara stood beside Evelyn and took her role with grave 5-year-old seriousness, holding the small bundle of wildflowers Noah had picked that morning with both hands, straight-armed, as though she was carrying something that required great care. Noah had picked the flowers. That was the thing that got Evelyn when she thought about it later. Not the ceremony itself, not the words, but Noah crouching in the meadow that morning with total concentration, selecting each stem individually, handing her the bundle with a look that said he understood more than his 6 years should have allowed. After the ceremony, when everyone was in the yard eating and talking in the way of a small community that has found a reason to be together, Evelyn stood for a moment near the fence with a cup of something cold and looked at the house. Her workroom window was visible from here, the south-facing one with the good light. She could see the corner of the fabric she'd left on the table when she'd come out that morning. She thought about who she'd been in that cabin in January, the version of herself who'd been doing the math by candlelight, counting hours and finding them insufficient. That woman had been real, hard and proud and frightened and stubborn in all the ways that had nearly killed her and also, she understood now, had kept her alive long enough to be found. She didn't want to undo that woman. She just didn't want to be only her anymore. Cole came to stand beside her. He had Danny on one side of him and Clara was already asleep against his shoulder, worn out by the importance of the morning. "All right?" he asked. She looked at the house. "Yes." "Good." He shifted Clara's weight. "Marcus says he needs you to settle an argument about whether the Kelton order is due the 15th or the 20th. "It's the 18th? I told him that yesterday." "I know. He wants you to tell him again." She handed Cole her cup and went to settle the argument, walking through the September afternoon with the particular ease of someone who knows exactly where she is and has decided with full information and clear eyes that it's where she wants to be. The county remembered that winter for a long time, not because of the blizzard, which had been bad, but not extraordinary. Not because of Silas Crow, who had retreated into a quieter version of himself after the land office episode and eventually sold his dry goods operation and moved east, which surprised no one who'd paid attention. What the county remembered was simpler than any of that. A man who looked at a horizon and saw what wasn't there. A woman who turned whatever she had into something warm. Two people who were each, separately, good at surviving, and found out, by accident or by luck, or by the specific stubbornness of deciding not to quit, that surviving together was something else entirely. Years later, when people in Harlan County saw a quilt with a certain quality, the seams clean, the colors doing something unexpected and right, they'd sometimes say it was a Mercer quilt, using her name for it the way places use a name that has sunk into the ground and stayed there. And they'd say it as a kind of shorthand for a particular idea, that what looks like scraps can become something whole, that what looks like an ending can be, if you're paying attention, just a hard kind of beginning. It wasn't always true. Most things that looked like endings were just endings. But sometimes it was true. And the people who knew the story of that winter knew it because they'd seen it, in the quilts, in the house on the Ashford Ranch with its workroom light on in the mornings, in the way a woman who had once been counting her last hours had learned, eventually, to stop counting and just live. That was the whole story. It was enough.
Let's buy.
Did that just go?
Alright, who wants to be base bitch?
What does base bitch do?
You basically sit here, watch the cams, open doors if you need to, and if you think someone's gonna die, teleport them back, pressing this button right here. Like this. But when you do it, you gotta be careful because it makes them drop everything they have on
We're
them.
getting walkies.
What does that mean, Tissue? Raiden?
We're getting walkie-talkies.
I don't think we need them, to be honest. Walkies are just unnecessary. I think
For base bitching, they can tell you where the loot is.
I guess, but it gets so complicated. And also it takes up a slot, so it's just not worth.
You don't even need a fucking flashlight.
You gotta do.
Maybe get two and then just have
Kinda
have a
dumb,
walkie.
bro. What are you talking about? I'm perfectly fine with a flashlight.
Alright, we'll buy it when we go to the next planet. Let's go. Bam!
But do I get like a shotgun for the dogs coming in, or what's happening here?
No, not yet, unless we kill Nutcracker, and then you can.
Oh, how to pick who's getting teleported, by the way, you have to select them on the screen.
Yeah, it has to be, it has to show up on the screen.
Whichever name is showing on the screen, like her. Is who you send back?
Alright guys, we can do it. Wait, so should we buy 2 walkie-talkies?
Oh, we only need like 100 more to make the quota.
How many walkie-talkies should I buy?
I think we get
Just
2,
two.
give 1 to Ben, and then 1 to Chandler.
Okay, and then
Mainly for door opening.
Now, how do I open a door?
so basically you look at the name on the camera, and then you type. It'll be like the door will be X8. You just type X8 and put enter, and it'll open up. Or close it. You can close them too. Who is in this? It's Daddy, Zerti, me, and Ben.
Is this round?
No, we couldn't afford it. So we're back in the jungle.
Do we buy walkies?
Oh yeah, shit. Wait, Zerti.
Yeah.
Wait, that's Ben. Okay.